Very warm welcome to you all, and I'd like to introduce the panel. We have Nick Kary, the author of the book, an extraordinary woodworker, joiner, furniture maker, cuts across any number of crafts. And I'm going to ask each of them, as I make these introductions, about how they actually make their living out of craft, out of working with their hands. So Nick, quick minute with you about how on earth you're making a living working with your hands.
It's an interesting question right now, John, because for the last, for all my life, I've been a furniture maker for the last 35 years, but in the last 2 or 3 years, I have not been making much furniture since my workshop burnt down. And since a publisher was interested enough to say, go ahead and write a book. So I've been spending 2 years not making a living as a furniture maker. But prior to that, that was the only way I made my living, supplementing it with teaching work in the last 10 years. But for the first 20 years or so, it was purely made as a maker, using my hands and employing some people from a small workshop for some of that period.
Wonderful, thanks so much, Nick. Next we have Lou Tonkin, coming from Cornwall. Much like Nick, when you get to read the book material, she was very inspired by her grandfather. So over to you, Lou, about how do you make your living out of making?
I make my living out of making a sort of different grades of ways. First of all, illustrating Nick's book, which is great. And I originally studied illustration at Art College, but I produce limited edition hand-printed artworks, which are all from lino block prints. I teach workshops and I sell various products online through social media or fairs, generally homeware products that can be the classic, beautiful and useful. Yeah, in any way I can adapt to print.
Wonderful, excellent, thanks very much, Lou. And so Nick Han, a very interesting organisation you've set up there, Letterpress Collective in Bristol, and you really do have a lineage in making, as I understand, with your grandfather being involved with the Spitfires and your immediate family involved with Concord. But how do you make a living out of making?
Well, so I went to an old school art college in the 1970s, and I spent a year in a room which was very much like this room, so full of presses and wood type and lead type, and then just kind of forgot about it for quite a long time, really, probably maybe even 40 years, 30, 40 years. And then I did a trip on a bicycle, sort of meeting makers, and I came back and I just felt like I didn't really want to work on a computer anymore, and started collecting machines, because at the time the last letterpress printer had just finished work in Bristol, and I was kind of thinking, where's it all going, so I started collecting stuff. And it was a case of kind of using the stuff I was collecting, really. So I sort of feel like I fell into it again, really, through sort of gathering, old disused equipment. And then nowadays I'm making a living from running workshops, printing for other people, printing our own things, printing stuff that we work a lot with poets and artists and musicians. So a lot of collaborations, really, and we try and bring people in. We're bang in the middle of Bristol, so and it was a big printing city, so it's just kind of bringing the machines back to life a little bit, and getting people coming in and sort of understanding this amazing, important process.
Wonderful, thanks very much indeed, Nick. So Nick Kary, so we've got two Nicks here, so it's going to have, I'll be using surnames. But Nick Kary, What drew you to write this book? An extraordinary book, by the way. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but what drew you to make it?
What drew me to write the book? I suppose as a maker, working in isolation for a lot of years, and especially perhaps with my particular character, but you muse a lot. You have a lot of time while you're in making for your mind to be occupied sort of casually. And I guess I was amassing a lot of thoughts and thinking. I was fascinated by the relationship of my mind to my body, and that realized that making was for me in part a distraction from being too busy in my mind. So it kind of grew. I didn't know, as I think you know, John, I didn't initially know exactly how the book was going to look. The book evolved, and it sort of revealed itself as it went. But I just knew I wanted, the title was really important to me. The title material was very important to me, because as a maker, we are very involved with the materials. And often that story of the materials is not something that comes to light through our work. Once our work is made, it is an object. So I think that really was, for me, what drew me to it.
I'm curious about, you mentioned in your book about the name material keep on coming back to you, and you weren't too sure why. And intuitively thought, well, yes, if it keeps on coming back, it's got to be about right. And much the same in terms of writing the book. You weren't exactly sure what you were going to be writing, what the end product was going to be. How is that with you all in terms of the actual making process? Are you very clear, all of you, on what the end point is, or do you start off and venture? How much of it is it an exploration? Lou, maybe.
Oh, it's always, for me, print and creating artwork is absolutely about the process rather than the end image being fully formed. I'm not just recreating a design that I've drawn out. Everything always changes as it goes. And actually that was a really lovely thing about illustrating the book for Nick, because his words spoke to me in a way that they really visually painted a picture. So it felt like the more I researched the work he'd looked into and written about, the more the work developed in its own storytelling way. They always change.
And how about for printing and at the press, at the collective?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the process of sort of starting something and not quite knowing how it's going to finish. I guess things are different, really. So if you're commissioned to do something, you have to be a little bit more precise and have an understanding, or at least the person you're doing it for has an understanding of what you're doing. But one of the great things about just sort of owning the means of production, which is a kind of Marxist thing, but I really like saying it, because you can do what you want with it, you know, and you can stay up all night and you can, you know, do something, reacting to something you're angry about or something you're passionate about. And I love just mixing ink and getting wood type out and not quite knowing where it's going. And it's sort of great fun, you know. I don't know if there's an equivalent in woodwork, or but it feels like a nice way of working.
Well, woodwork can often almost be oppositional to spontaneity because of planning a job and jointing and all of that. But I have, over the years, I've really fought that. So for me, I do my best to let it be organic and let it take place. But it is challenging, because you've got a piece that has to hold together. You've got to make joints in the right way. You've got to be fairly planned, otherwise you'll get yourself into problems. So it's always quite entertaining that way. And for entertaining, perhaps read frustrating as well, because it's kind of like, you know, journeying out to see where you're going to go, but actually in the process you've complicated your life rather enormously. So it's a constant reciprocal relationship.
And how does that relate to your writing? Where did you think you were starting and heading to, and where did you actually end up?
Well, I'm not sure. I remember when I was asked to write the synopsis, and so coming up with something and looking at it and going, you know, I better submit that because the publishers need to see a synopsis, but I really don't think it's going to stick to that. And sure enough, it just evolves because you start on something and your mind starts working with the next stage and you end up perhaps drifting off in a slightly different direction. You like the sound of something or you like an idea that's come to you and suddenly before you know it, you're off somewhere different. And that's kind of what I did. I drifted, perhaps was not the right word, but I intuited and let the book lead me. I really did. And I was, you know, it was one of the joys of it. And I did love writing it. And even to the point where most of my writing was done in cafes. And so people would come up and ask me what I was doing, or someone would share a story with me. And some of these stories actually have got into the book from their start in the cafe. So it really was sort of on the hoof in many respects.
Nick, I'd like to ask you to do a first reading, if I may.
I would love to, John. We're selected to read, these will just be 2 or 3 minute reads. And this one is from the first chapter of the book, a chapter called Roots, which grounds the book in the story. Well, it grounds me in the book and also where we live and also making. I have come to think through making, am inextricably bound to it, but also to all the contradictions implicit in that relationship. Now there is a growing thirst and interest in what it means to make, and I can't help but reflect on a longing I had 35 years ago, and on what I see and hear around me now. Having made the decision to alter my path and ground myself in the journey to become a maker, I never imagined I would spend 35 years in one vocation. It is tempting to ask why I have made a life of something so physical and demanding. Only recently, particularly through the traumatic but cleansing event of my workshop burning down, have I come to find an answer to that question. I have developed the ability to transform material into any form I wish within nature's laws. I have built our own home and filled the homes of countless others with furniture. I and all those who make are to some degree magicians, alchemists, the transformers of base nature into something undeniably human. This is not something I've understood before. I have simply made to live, unaware of how essential making is to the idea of being human. As a maker, I feel my humanity, my human being, the potential and danger I represent. The home that we have built for our family is a particular result of this dual relationship. We live in a wood where we have built our house and cabins, our studio and workshops. The woods up here hold the water, act as conduits for it, and cling in their deep brackish mulch to it over summer and winter. It rises willfully, raw freedom from the earth, and all becomes soft, musty, musky, fetid with deep life. The sycamores, beeches, chestnuts, and oaks cast their seeds into this receptive womb, and the unstoppable, unnameable life force rises anew from it each season. We, on our small plot, sit in the middle of 20 or so acres of mainly beechwood, planted 100 years ago on a ridge to protect the crops from sea and moor-birthed gales. 100 years of their growth and whatever preceded them have cast the ground brackish, our property, the break, taking its name from the soil. Home has become more than a place, more than shelter. Home for me is a manifestation of my material connection to life. It is the point at which wild land and our ingenuity meet, where the soul finds rest and endeavor finds the opportunity for expression. We don't need to build our own house. We just need to interact, to tend to a garden or window box, to cook our own food and make some of the things we require. Once we do these things, we begin to create stories of our connection here, of the meaning of this life, and we root all the more to the earth beneath us.
Thanks very much indeed, Nick. I'm curious about Nick and Lou. How how do you relate to this? What space do you have to mull on this relationship with the material as alchemists?
We have that all the time, don't we? Again, as makers working on our own, in our own little studios, we all have time for that musing. And of course, the materials play a very strong part. There's one illustration in Nick's book, which I allowed myself to indulge in a personal touch, which is tool hand, because I had my tools. And they're the only thing that, you know, most people get worried if they've lost their keys or their wallet. But if I think I've put my tools down somewhere and left them, I'd feel a quickening. So it's all part of it.
Can we see that picture, Lou?
Of tool hand?
Yeah. Thanks.
Beautiful. And Nick, you're on mute.
Yeah, someone asked about materials and our connection with natural materials, and especially in this time, you know, when you're kind of ostracized from family and friends. And also someone asked about, what was the other question? There was another question which was kind of a little bit related. Oh, something about the, you know, how important is real in the digital world, and will it be important in generations to come? And I think those are questions which relate to this a little bit. So for me, you know, I have another room where I kind of do computer stuff and answer emails. And if I'm there a couple of hours, I just feel a bit uncomfortable. And I'm really envious of Ellen, who I work with, who works in this room all the time. And, you know, I want to be in here, you know, and there is a thing, I don't know whether it's, I don't know how many people are dyslexic here, but Ellen and I are both really dyslexic, and I sort of feel like handling stuff kind of really helps us really, and also handling letters, weirdly, you know, two dyslexic people setting type might be a bit of a worrying scenario, but but it's really great. So this is a kind of happy place really, and I don't think it'll ever change, that thing about future generations. I think, you know, I look forward to going home and cooking. I think about what I'm going to cook, and I sort of picture the stuff in my hands, you know, and in a way it's the same. And I think it's sort of in all of us, and I think it won't go away. That's my feeling.
Nick, who did you write this book for? Who did you have in mind when you were writing it?
Everyone. I was really clear about that. I didn't want it to be a niche book. I really, I passionately believe in why we have these, you know, what it is these are for, what this is for. And I didn't want a book that was just for makers. I really wanted to share stories and invite people to find their own stories. And, you know, I'm essentially a beginner. I might have been a maker all my life, all my working life pretty much, but there's always something new. And so the book was really an offering of stories, narratives, the joy of visiting other makers and building relationship with them, finding their practice, sharing that, which I know Nick also experienced when he went on his bicycle and met makers too. And it's a wonderful thing to do. So I wanted to share those stories with anyone who would listen, rather than looking at a particular marketplace.
And in producing this book, of course, you work closely with Lou. And perhaps, I don't know how frequently, I know, Nick, and you do work collaboratively with a lot of people, but how was that relationship? They seem quite solitary activities, but you came together for the production of this book. And how was that?
It was wonderful. I mean, you know, Lou and I met initially through my son Felix, who I was looking and speaking to various illustrators, and I was looking for something when I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for. I barely knew what a lithograph was. I mean, I did, lino cut was. I know it was related to woodcuts, and I love the idea of woodcuts. But when we met, it was, and when I saw, Lou's work, it was obvious. And the way we worked, and I'm sure Lou will say a bit more about this in a minute, was for me, simply, we agreed if I gave her passages, relatively short passages from the book, perhaps, I think 100 or 200 words, she would respond to those for each chapter. And she did that amazingly, really amazingly. And for me, it was the most beautiful process because we seemed to understand each other. And she could put my descriptive writing, initiate an image through that. And each image stands alone. They are not, she responded so much to the material that not her own generic style is visible, but it's by no means, she adapted and changed and shifted to what was needed, and that was fantastic.
How was it for you on the other side, being given sections of passages to read?
It was fantastic. I can show you the first page when we met up in the cafe. I went home with this page, which was just endless scribbles of prompts from each chapter that we discussed. But it was discussed with such warmth and passion and enthusiasm for the book and what each chapter meant that it made perfect sense. And there were definitely chapters that I picked out first. I didn't illustrate it in order at all. I think the final illustration in the book was one of the first I did. And if there was a chapter where, again, I wasn't sure what it was, I felt really comfortable to phone Nick up at any time and go, Nick, what's this about? And I'd get some new wonderful story that we hadn't shared the first time in the cafe that was maybe missed because there was something else beautiful we were talking about. So it felt like a learning process as well as an illustrating process, and making a great friend at the end of it.
So
absolutely.
I guess collaboration between craftspeople, and then there's collaboration with those who are coming new to the craft or working with their hands. There's a question here that I kind of want to just unpack a little bit here about how important is it in terms of running classes, running courses, working with the public in your livelihood, and how important is that? But not just financially and as part of sort of a diversified livelihood, but how important is that to you? And what do you get out of, if anything, of introducing people to your craft? How important is that to you? Nick Kary.
Well, for me, it's really important. And sometimes there's in fact, I've got a workshop coming up on Saturday with 4 people. We've had to make them a bit smaller. We've got quite a big space, but we've made them smaller. But I mean, this particular process goes back, as I said before, to Gutenberg, which is like 1450, and the process really hasn't changed. And it's, I think it's really interesting using. I love watching people who kind of pick up a wood type, for example, and that wood type's been used hundreds of times. And I talk to people about what words it might have made, and like I said, we're kind of dyslexic, Ellen and I, but there's this kind of fascination with putting words together a letter at a time and really thinking about those words. And I love watching other people do that and that kind of process. And then you do a kind of pull, you put ink on it, and then you do your first pull. And children, their face just lights up. It's amazing to watch, and it never changes. And one of the things I loved about Nick's book is that his kind of examination of words, and looking at taking the words apart, looking at the Latin, looking at the word in other languages, and so I love it when you just take a single word and with the big word wood, we've got some wood type which is kind of about a foot high, so you can only put 4 letters in on one of these presses. So it kind of limits what you can do, but sometimes the limitations are nice. It's really interesting. So you never know who's going to come through the door. You don't know if they're an artist, a poet, a teacher, someone that works in a hospital. So they've all got something else, and they're able to kind of use this equipment to kind of, first of all, kind of relax, because I think once you get over the technical issues of putting stuff together, then it's just enjoyment, really. So it's I love watching it, and new people are always interesting anyway. Just finding out about them and what they do, and spending a day with someone, it's quite sort of like a privilege, really, I guess. So,
Nick, you were just about to open up your workshop again before COVID. What do you get out of opening up that workshop?
Sorry, John, I missed that. What
do you get out of opening up your workshop and introducing you?
First of all, one of the main things is it's terribly, terribly sad seeing the space unused. And I think all spaces should be used, and tools sitting in cupboards all very neatly. It seems almost wrong. So normally teaching, to me, passing on and sharing is a really vital part of being a maker. But particularly, it's not just about direct skills for me. It's really about the energy in a workshop. It's about where people are internally as much as externally, because especially with woodwork, people can often feel embattled a bit and fighting the necessary skills. And I always start people with green woodwork because it's not resistant. It's easy to do. Anyone can manage it. I've had 4-year-olds on shaving horses, and it's very, very easy, and it doesn't bring the mind judgment in. The more technical the work gets, the more mind judgment comes in. So it's a real lesson about letting go of the thinking again. So I enjoy all that aspect of it. I enjoy the fact that we could use words like therapeutic, developmental, all manner of words. But it really helps the thinking. And, when I work with the Schumacher students, for instance, that is particularly current for them, that they are who very often in their heads very much as they're doing postgraduate work, and being in their bodies really excites them, and where they realize that there's another part of their thinking that's coming alive. So I love that.
And I guess you're using wood, of course, a tree cut down. How do you work with the students or people coming to your workshop if they're coming for the first time, or in terms of that process of transformation, how they might relate to the material? Of course, it's a very personal thing, but how do you open up that space and give them the license?
That's easy, because in starting with green woodwork, they literally come in to tree trunks, small tree trunks, this much in diameter. And the first thing they do is start splitting those down, cutting and splitting them. So they're right in with the raw material. Sometimes I have the opportunity to take them out harvesting that material. And there's actually a section in the book when I recently did that with some students over the summer, over last summer. And obviously you're then really rooting them in the story. If you're bringing them into meticulously straight-edged planks immediately, then it is a bit more difficult to get that relationship with the material. That's why I enjoy the green woodwork so much with them.
Nick, I was wondering if you have a section in your book about metamorphosis, transformation.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might just dip into that a little bit.
Okay. So this is from the second chapter of the book called Metamorphic, which the chapter seeks to embed the idea to change our idea of landscape and to see all the extraction that's actually been done in that landscape over thousands and thousands of years, and to make us a little bit more familiar with things we take for granted. This particular passage I've chosen was set up on Dartmoor near Haytor. Crossing over the stream and making our way uphill to the back of Haytor, we find the tree cover stops abruptly and bracken-strewn heath replaces it. Up above us, the great Tor looms, its northern face scuffed and fissured, rubble boulders at its feet, a flattened small plateau running east from it. When we get up to it, we follow it around the side of the Tor, carved granite tracks at our feet. The transition is sudden. While the wild thrust of ancient magma rises on one side, industry cascades on the other. Great granite chippings littering the ground, the carved granite cart tracks a conduit for the hundreds of thousands of tons of material that ran downhill on them away from here. The sounds I hear are of falling hammers, shouting men, and the rock straining for release. As the network of canals threaded their way across the country in the 18th century, soon followed by the trundling steam engine, the landscape of locality opened its doors to a world of international trade. This inhospitable place became a quarry, the granite a resource, a material chipped and blasted from ancient rock. Imagining myself among the rolling carts, crashing hammers and yelling workers, I struggle to see the unity of natural forces and our own. Rather, I feel the violation that the landscape was being subjected to as great bastions of time and permanence were split, hewn, and extracted. As the writer and archaeologist Jacquetta Hawke says, humankind has been much more effective than rivers or glaciers at transporting and mixing the surface deposits of the planet. Yet in hindsight, with time and lichens softening the edges, it is almost possible to view the forces of people and nature as part of the same continuum. The granite tracks slowly sink into the grasslands. The quarries fill with water and wildlife. The tips grow over with moss, heather, gorse, and thyme. The quarried granite rises anew across the country, the quartz and mica in it reflecting light in our cities, buildings reflecting their grandeur and aspirations in it. Each block, face-edged, neatly laid in lines, speaks little of the raw granite drilled, chipped and cut, heaved by men from the eroded Tor. It speaks little of the trundling carts and workhorses straining through the dusk of a wet Dartmoor day, or of the bargemen, sailors, boat builders and engineers who enabled its migration and evolution. It says nothing of the millennia before we arrived and evolved to rearrange the order of things.
That's lovely. Lou, did you read that passage before you did your print for that chapter?
Well, I only had a little section. I've never read the full amount. But actually, that was one of the ones that sat back until later. And I was given more information as we went along. I really enjoyed illustrating that chapter.
I'm kind of curious, Lou, and I'd love for you to just show us that that print for that chapter, and perhaps describe maybe, you know, what were you feeling as you were looking to try and create this image on that? What were you sensing in terms of what you're drawing from what Nick was writing, and your own sense and familiarity, of course, being from Cornwall, of that landscape and the heritage, and you know, the tough love of that land?
Absolutely. Well, of course, for me, it didn't actually come from reading Nick's words. So it's a slightly different interpretation. It came from a conversation about the chapter, and certainly pinpointing to different places. And yes, it's very much part of my landscape growing up. I grew up near St Just, right at the bottom by Land's End, which is, you know, Geaver Mine and Metallic Mines, the classics that we see out there. But this was a landscape that Nick had mentioned to me which I then went and researched. It's just something very raw about those landscapes. They are brutal, but they're also really beautiful. And the history that's there is, you can feel it.
That was, you looked at Blue Hill's tin mine for that picture, didn't you?
It was St Agnes, wasn't it?
Yes, St Agnes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess this is, in many ways, Nick, you dive into that word, the etymology of material and matter, and ultimately this book is about that matter does matter. And I just wondering if you could maybe unpack that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, so the word material obviously relates to matter. They both come from mater, Latin mother, and they relate to things like breeding stock and materials we make things from and various other things. It's quite a broad etymology, but it all does relate back to this thing of the birthing of through mother and of the earth. And it's very much so, and the feminine too. So that was really struck me. What really struck me was most people would say material and making were very masculine, had been certainly very masculine things, and matter. So I was just interested as a kind of wordsmith in playing on that, you know, what matters. Matter in terms of boring physics lessons at school, where I used to slip off my chair and fall on the floor, you know, and not understanding the way I was being taught. And then you begin to look at the etymology and how word has evolved, and you begin to understand it. So, and for me, discovering that mater, mother, that was a really important step. And that this Mother Earth that we live on, that we need to care for her, and that's implicit in that word material. It's there, it's rooted.
And that working with matter is key, of course, to what makes us human. And there's a lovely question here around, well, I guess it's in relationship to the chapter where Lynn, I think it's Lynn, was writing about the basket cases, and in the First World War, how this idea of this term basket cases arising out of those people who with mental health, you know, with severe repercussions on their mental health after World War I, going into craft, and what therapeutic benefits that brought to them. And I presume all three of you must have experience of this in terms of people that you engage with. Maybe Nick can.
I mean, I think I was thinking about, I can't remember her name now, but there was a writer who was the writer who worked at the Hogarth Press, and her husband who ended up, she was a poet and a writer. Anyway, she had depression, and she would set type, she said it really helped her, and she kind of lost herself in the process of setting small lead type for hours on end. And I'm sort of convinced that that process is very helpful. One of the things that we talked about, I think Nick and I the other day, was about the isolation of making, and I think it's really interesting, that thing of sort of being on your own and sort of getting to know yourself. For me, you know, doing long bicycle rides, going off for months on end on my own, it's really interesting because you know, we don't spend much time on our own really, but when you know, a lot of makers do just work on their own and spend days on their own, and I think that's an interesting thing in itself, being alone as a maker. It's kind of weird for me because I'm in a building with 30 other people in a co-op and in the middle of Bristol, so I can't really say that myself, but it's I don't know really. It would be interesting to know what Lou and Nick think about that kind of process, really, kind of process of working, and how it might help with sort of kind of mental health, really.
Lou?
Well, I think I mean, obviously the process of doing a craft is naturally immersive. You're doing something with your hands, and you're immersing yourself in a whole creative process, which you can't help but let it take you somewhere. And we were talking about teaching workshops. If you go to somewhere in the process when I'm teaching, we're in a lovely environment, and you absorb that, and then we go back and draw it. So we're transferring that, and I think it connects you to your landscape, your surroundings, yourself, and how you fit into that landscape. And then you're thinking about the process of actually carving that image, that thought process into a block. And I've certainly had people on my workshops. There's one that I'm thinking of, especially if she's watching this, she'll know who she is. She came to a short workshop, and she hadn't drawn for years. She didn't really know if she could draw. She liked the thought of drawing, and she really wanted to do print and wanted to create good prints, but had no idea where to start. And it was a short workshop, but she was so petrified by the process of drawing, committing those marks to paper, that she just couldn't do anything. She was completely frozen by it. She's since gone on, she's come back to different workshops. She has totally thrown herself into it, to the point that now, every time she has a break from the thing she's meant to be doing, she has her little kit in a bag. So she sits and cuts a block and sends me pictures of images she's done. It's given her fantastic confidence in her ability to create something, but also in a wider field that she can take on a challenge and do well and enjoy it. And it felt good for her.
Is this a making prescription that the NHS can hand out, Nick Kary?
I think absolutely. I think for certain trades and certain skill sets, it's great. As I've already sort of hinted with furniture making, it is somewhat tricky on some aspects, but I've certainly taught a lot of people over the years who have chatted about sort of borderline mental health issues. And more serious at times, and how the making and the focus on the hands takes them away from their mind, a little bit like I was saying earlier. And I would say that my own journey into making was out of that place. I have certainly suffered from depression when I started going into it. So it took me away from that and allowed me something else, which I didn't know what to expect, but I kind of had a sense of it. And I find a lot of young people coming to me who have this. Actually, just 2 days ago, an 18-year-old girl who I've known for some years through her parents rang me because she has stopped school. She doesn't want to do school anymore, and she wants to do something with her hands. She's decided it's furniture making and woodwork. And I've spoken to so many young people at that who've been a bit lost at school, who have felt out of their depth, who have felt unrequited, who may even, I can think of 2 who have suffered depression and have been able to go out of the house and weren't even able to go to school at all anymore. So there's a lot of that out there. It's a big, I'm sure one day someone will study that area a lot, but there is no doubt about it that any form of activity like that, where we get a reflection of our own capacity back to us, has got to be healing. Whether it is writing is definitely one, whether it's music or whether it's making of some form or another, cooking, all those things, they reflect back to us our capacity.
Wonderful.
I was going to say it's not the NHS that hands out the prescription. It will be a government, and the government decided to take art, woodwork, metalwork, photography off the curriculum. And I know you talk about this in your book a little bit, Nick, as well. And that's where the prescription needs to be. It needs to be in schools. It needs to be on the curriculum. And I think it was Michael Gove that did it originally. So he's probably got a lot to answer for. So I think you need to look to get that back on the curriculum and get kids doing art and design, woodwork, metalwork, again. That's the prescription. Someone also said it was Leonard and Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf who typeset her own books. Thanks.
Now we have come to 45 minutes here, and I do want to open up more to these questions. We have been drawing on them throughout this session. But Nick, perhaps just could we have a final reading if you feel there's one that is leaping out to you right now to be read out?
Yes, I do have a third one here, John, which I would like to read, which is from the chapter Tool Hand, with, you know, Lou's lovely image on the front of that chapter. And this is, we used to live in Mexico, and this is an experience. This is kind of a recollection of an experience in a town in Mexico that only makes copper vessels. Everyone in that town is involved in the making of copper vessels. The ringing has continued in our absence. One of Juan's sons standing in for him, and as we approach, they are just finishing off their work. The hammer blows more delicate, the pace quite slow. We find logs to sit on, while the kids stand, fascinated by the visceral texture of the image in which they find themselves. The fire is being stoked again, and one of the other sons picks up a rough copper ingot and throws it on. The bellows are pumped by foot, inflating lungs driving up the heat, silent orange-red sparks drifting and disappearing into the air. Time stills and moves quietly, and without a word, the four men move around the anvil. The youngest son, crouched by the fire, holding and turning the ingot with long-handled tongs. He brings it to the anvil and places it down, and without a word, the great hammers ascend in order like multiple second hands on a clock face. It is a performance that remains with me, so beautiful and engrossing to watch. As one hammer hits the copper ingot and rises, another is already falling. And in the tiny interval, the copper is moved fractionally towards the held image of its future form. The kids are enraptured, quite silent, their eyes following every movement, every clenching and releasing muscle, every indentation that appears in the copper surface, every rotation of the clock's hands. The copper form rises from the ingot, the tensions in it supporting a new shape as it goes from fire to anvil and back. The red-hot and curved plate it had now become is placed on a new anvil, its round head mirroring a sense of it in a sense of a future shape. The hammers raining down on it, encouraging it into malleable compliance. The men's faces are flushed with sweat, the repetitive actions demanding their energy, the heat of the day is still alive, even though the sun is now low. The cooperation of the men, the unity of the family, as the women are always close, glasses of agua de Jamaica brought to us, a stint on the bellows or tongs, clothes dry on lines away from the smoke of the fire, small children play at the rim of the scene. The copper is hollowing, stretching itself around a bubble of air, a new long-necked anvil reaching inside, and 3 of the men have now gone back to the first anvil, while only Juan rotates and hits the vessel. The neck slowly closes in on the anvil, the body bellowing out from under it, the edge forming as a lip around a mouth. The copper is touched by a signature of heat, rose reds and golds striating its surface. Juan asked me again if I am sure that I don't want him to decorate the basic form. And when I repeat myself, I sense his puzzlement, disappointment even, that I am somehow stymieing his creativity. So he moves to burnish it with a different tool and longer caressing actions as he works around it repetitively. The color and shine of the heat-hued copper emerge gloriously. The texture of the hammer blows like scales on a leaping fish.
Well, that was lovely, Nick. I have to admit, I'm curious about the visual nature of your writing. And the way that you do write it must be, I fancy, so influenced by your making and your long history in making, that it is beautifully visual. So I'd like to more explicitly move to the questions that have been raised here. There is an observation here from Bridget about knowing the history of who has made some products, so there's some material products around, and having them around, knowing some of that history, where they've come from and who's worked them. Many people find that profoundly important and reassuring and comforting. I know for myself, the most poignant moment for me with this was a stone axe, which I think I've told you about, Nick, a stone axe that came into my possession just for a moment in its time anyway, because it was 10,000 years old. And for that moment, I took it to a museum to have it looked at. It was rather unusual. It was about this sort of size, and it had a couple of notches just down below from the blade, and a hole drilled through the back end of it. And 2 weeks later, I went to go and pick it up again. And the people in the museum felt, well, in fact, probably the likely story for this one was that it was made about 10,000 years ago. But then 4,000 years later, it was adapted with those notches cut in and that hole drilled in, so it could be part of a mechanical implement. And there was a tool made 10,000, refashioned 4,000 years later. And then for a moment in my hands, it went off to a museum in Germany. But that I had it in my hands, I felt real reverence for it. And I don't know how you three may relate to that sort of feeling. And indeed, if you're aware that, in fact, perhaps for many of the people who you pass your craft on or who purchase your craft, are you conscious of what meaning it gathers? Nick Kary.
That feels like quite a big question. I love that. I can't remember his name now. The guy. I think there was a radio program and a book, and it's called "The History of the World in 100 Objects." And actually reading the book, Nick's book, did make me think of that, because, like you say, the book's really visual and also really sort of soulful. And I think one of the things I always like to do when we print something here is put something in that talks about how the print came about and why we did it. And I think the story behind something like, if you saw the axe example, you'd have to tell the story to be able to get that across. So I do love hearing stories, and this book brings so many things alive. Like this section about Nick talks about building boats, and I just love that. It felt like it's very sort of filmic to me. I could sort of see the village and I could see people working, and Nick even at the end of that chapter placed himself in that village, and talked about what role he'd have in the, or he'd choose anyway, in that process. For example, who would know that it takes 40 acres of oak woodland to make one ship in that era. I don't know, Nick will say how long ago it was, a few hundred years, but
18th century.
What was it, Nick?
18th century.
Okay.
18th century.
So I love those stories, bringing something alive through storytelling, and I think this book does it amazingly well.
Lou, I've got a question here for you from Melanie. What would be the starting points to recommend, that you would recommend to encourage children to create freely? Where do you start?
I think it's really taking away the end goal of creating an artwork. So it's got to be about play. I at any workshop for any age, I start by using old bits of torn up paper to just play some games. So blindfolded drawing, drawing with your wrong hand, drawing behind your back, drawing without looking at the paper or taking the pencil off, just creating fun with it. I mean, drawing with your wrong hand whilst leaving the pencil on and not being able to take it off and drawing each other, there's hours of fun in that. And if that can help loosen up someone to enjoy the process of drawing rather than being scared of it, then that's got to be the best way to start. It's not something to be precious about. It's just something to do and enjoy.
So Nick, a similar question to you as a want-to-be maker, but with no idea how to start. Do you have any tips on how to get started?
Well, first of all, I'm going to quote a friend of mine many years ago when I was another book that I've been working on for many years, and I was prevaricating about it. And she looked over to me rather impatiently and said, "Nick, for goodness sake, just start." And even though that does sound a bit basic, I think we invent all sorts of reasons why we don't start something. It's too difficult. We don't understand this. We don't know. We have to be prepared to get things wrong. So that's one thing I would say. Other than that, decide what, find the support. Nowadays, thank heavens, there are so many makers who are teaching. And that wasn't always the way. And it really is possible to find all sorts of courses and to find really talented instructors who are doing that. And I very rarely get to learn new things because I'm so fixed in what I do these days. But some years ago, a year ago, I did classes with my friend John Hagger, who trades as Tanner Bates, as a leather worker. And we were doing these, few mates of his got together and we did these classes through the winter, or it was more like a men's group really. And it was so enjoyable learning something I was unfamiliar with. And I have a problem with one of my eyes and I find it incredibly difficult to thread a needle, always have. And I was really sort of dreading sort of making a fool of myself in class by trying to thread a needle. And I just ended up enjoying it and finding a pace in the work and in a lack of expectation on myself that was just fantastic.
Nick, Han, I'm going to follow up with that. A question just come in about where does the making begin? Is it in the imagination? Is it more visceral than that in our belly? Or is it in the material itself? Is it calling out for a particular action?
Well, I guess for me and working with other people as well, and I was going to ask Lou a little bit about lino as well. That yeah, I think it does start in material really, whether it's sort of paper or ink or I mean, I quite like an idea, I guess. I mean, I kind of like ideas, and you know, in Bristol we had you know, the Colston statue come down recently, and that kicked off quite a lot of things. And people kept saying to me, "Oh, you should, you know, you're only 100 yards away. You should print something." And actually, we did print something about 3 or 4 years ago to do with Colston, and there was a group called Countering Colston, and we were sort of confronting some of the people, but. So I guess for me personally, it has to come from something I'm passionate about in terms of content. But I was going to ask Lou a question and connected, I guess, a little bit of that, because when she held the book up, I really liked the scale of those drawings. And obviously I guess they've been reduced for the book a little bit. And I wondered whether Lou might do some printing from the linos and have them available. I'm probably not a great thing to say, but publishers won't thank me, but it would be nice to have some access to, you know, prints from the linos and of that scale. I think they'd be really lovely things.
Yeah, absolutely. It was something that me and Nick discussed right at the beginning, that in terms of the creative process and of not creating waste, that the images should be printed in and enjoyed as well as in the book. They are a separate craft on their own. They are a little bit bigger, not much. This is the front cover image. So they all sit within an A4. But there's obviously something lovely about the quality of the line with an original print, as you know.
Well, wonderful. I just we just got a couple more questions, and I think we'll draw it to a close. And I'd ask for some final reflections from you all. So there's value in imperfections, in error, or the frustration of not achieving one vision. Is there a frustration in that? Nick Kary.
It's an interesting question. It's a really good question. Yes, there's definitely frustration along the way, but I think part of the journey is actually embracing the frustration. I'm very struck by our word mistake. Missed take. It's a missed take. It's not a mistake. It's not some great problem, some weighty thing. It's just a mistake. You know, you take a picture, didn't turn out that great, you take another one. And that really helps me engage with the whole thing, because the learning is in our willingness to get it wrong and to evolve. And now woodwork is a very unforgiving, I keep on repeating this, it's quite unforgiving. If you cut your joint wrong, it's loose, the piece won't get together, but there are always ways, you develop ways to evolve with these things, but it's just so good to keep yourself loose enough. And if you start getting into your head too much with the worried about getting it right, then that's where the problem starts. So we get it wrong, and it just gets a little bit less wrong as we learn more, and always a bit less wrong. And so one day we go, wow, I've got some skills I didn't know I had.
And Lou, I presume there's no such thing as perfection, is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, as Nick says, the more you do something, the less you make a mistake in it. But actually, I love mistakes. Mistakes are the way you learn. If you get everything right every time, or if you just keep doing the one thing you know you can do without mistakes, then you're not going to learn anything. And learning is such a joy. I've definitely changed many lino blocks over the years from something that would have been a mistake. I certainly had a bird once that was looking ahead and accidentally chopped its beak off, so it ended up looking behind itself, and it was a much better print for it. It's good to make mistakes.
So we'll be coming to the end now, but just one or two words, sort of final reflection. Mine are, Nick, that I'm just profoundly privileged to be associated with this work and to call you a friend. It's been an important book for me in so many respects, so thank you very much for that. But any final reflections, Nick or Lou? Oh, Lou, you're muted.
The same reflection. I just feel really honoured to be part of it and to know Nick and to have had that relationship. And I actually haven't got a book yet, so I'm really excited to sit and read through it when I've got one.
Yeah, so for me, I love reading this book. I think it's really a soulful thing, and I think there's a kind of an outpouring. And you know, I don't know if it's, I know Nick had this sort of tragic thing of the studio burning down, but I don't know if that's kind of part of the kind of outpouring really. But you know, if it is, we're all going to sort of benefit from it, because it is, you know, I love reading it, and I'm not really a great reader. I'm sort of visual person, and like you said, John, I think the amazing thing about this book is, for me, is it is very visual. I mean, you know, apart from Lou's sort of beautiful kind of illustrations, which are kind of breathing spaces between the chapters, it is you know, a very visual thing. And the other thing I really liked about it is it felt like a sort of set of essays, really, and all short stories, in that, you know, each thing kind of moves somewhere else, whether it was another continent or another craft, or I loved that aspect of it, that it kind of leapt around a little bit in a really great way. So I love being part of this process, so thank you very much for asking me.
Nick, I'll leave the last word to you, Nick Kary, and then I'll round up.
Well, you know, it's very touching. I loved writing the book. I loved my interaction with Lou regarding it, and finding Lou and the images. I've loved meeting Nick. And this, you know, right now with the images in our, you know, sadly Lou can't transmit from her studio space because technology won't allow it. But Nick and I are both in our workspaces, and seeing Nick's printing presses, I kind of want to get in there. I want to come, Nick, and I want to twirl that thing around and play like a kid.
You're welcome.
You know,
anytime.
I will definitely be up. Nick and I actually have never met in person, so so I look forward to that relationship developing. And John, to you.
Workshop.
Sorry?
We should go and do a workshop with Nick.
Yes, let's do that. So that's okay. Okay, Nick, it's booked.
That'd be great. That would be great. Perfect.
We'll do that. But and John, with you, thank you so much for holding my hand with this book. It's my first book I've had published, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And thank you, Chelsea Green, very much for publishing it.
And thank you to all of you for attending from around the world. We have people coming from Canada and further afield joining us. So thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. And panelists, thanks very much indeed.